When you study people and culture, it's usually important to have a strict ethical code to protect yourself, your colleagues, and the people that you are studying. While I am certainly no anthropologist, I do have a degree in anthropology because once upon a time I was an archaeologist, and I had ethical anthropological practice drilled into my head repeatedly by numerous professors over the course of my education. Anthropology, for those who don't know, is the study of people and culture. The etymology of the word anthropology literally means the study of humankind in ancient Greek. It is a broad umbrella that can cover everything from bioarchaeology and forensics to the study of language and religion. If you have ever watched Star Trek, specifically Star Trek The Next Generation, you're probably very familiar with anthropological ethics, as each episode seems to tackle a different ethical dilemma that the crew of the Enterprise must then work through, all while trying to cause the least amount of harm while also conducting thorough scientific research. For those uninitiated in anthropological ethical practice, ask yourself, what would Jean-Luc Picard do?
We're out here to explore, to make contact with other life forms, to establish peaceful relations but not to interfere. And absolutely not to destroy.
Anthropology has arguably been practiced and studied since ancient times. We have works from the Greek historian Herodotus, as well as the Roman historian Tacitus, and multiple others who give accounts of people and culture that they come across through their studies. Studies in early anthropology would be occurring all around the world for centuries, as you had these mass movements of people who were coming in contact with new religions and belief systems and ways of life, and people would interpret these new ideas through their own cultural lens before either writing them down or orally passing them on. It was the centuries after the discovery of the New World that anthropology would really begin to transform and turn into the defined field that we know it as today. With Europe's colonial expansion across the world and the Age of Enlightenment in full swing, European scholars were beginning to take a closer look at the people and cultures that their respective nations were conquering. And it is here that we have the roots of modern anthropological practice. These modern roots of the study of anthropology were being sown on the back of European colonialism and cultivated by the wealthy white members of European society. And unsurprisingly, they had the biases and beliefs of the wealthy white members of society in those days. Anthropology began with the innocent desire to understand other human beings, but it ended up being wielded like a weapon that aimed to further subjugate colonized nations and to prop up the intelligence of certain races. White Europeans already felt like hot shit after conquering half the world, but now anthropologists were backing up those egos with science. Phrenology was the study of the human skull and how intelligence and personality characteristics would actually determine the shape of the skull. Many early modern anthropologists discovered that different races had different skull shapes, and as a result, some were more or less advanced. Can you guess which race was considered to be the most wonderfully smart and intelligent? Today, phrenology is definitely considered pseudoscience, as all of these claims have been debunked. However, certain modern anthropologists haven't gotten the memo. But more on that in a little bit. So why am I talking about ethics or morals or being a good person? Well, like I said, I started my career in anthropology and moved into cultural heritage, and the ethics are very similar. Some museums are trying to clean up the ethical messes of years past, while others are choosing just to ignore it altogether. The ethics of how we study people and cultures extend to them even after those people and cultures are dead and gone. Or at the very least, they should. Museums and cultural institutions around the world contain human remains that were plundered, pillaged, stolen, illicitly purchased during the colonial era. And the way that we talk about, interpret, and display these human remains, if we display them at all, has changed drastically over even just the last 2 decades. I put a post on my community tab a few weeks ago where I asked my subscribers a few questions. Where do human remains belong? Who do they belong to? Doesn't matter if they are handled by people who choose science over ethical practice. Big shout out to everybody who responded to that thread. I really loved the conversations that were happening. So keeping those questions that I asked in the back of our minds as we go forward, let's talk about human remains and museum collections. So, as I've already mentioned, European colonialism was a thing that happened. And during this time, a lot of wealthy members of European society traveled about and began collecting trinkets, souvenirs, and even human remains. And they began to create collections. And these collections would, in some cases, go on to form the foundational collections of some of the biggest museums in the world. I've actually covered the history of the modern museum and their foundation as a curiosity cabinet in a drawing room. If you want to watch that video, I will share a link in the description. But for the sake of this conversation, what you need to know essentially is that sometimes human remains would end up in people's personal collections, and then sometimes those collections would turn into some of the modern museums that we know today. As a result, hundreds and hundreds of human remains are in various museum collections around the world. So you actually don't see human remains on display as often as you used to. And this is partially due to the fact that there have been certain ethical concerns put forward by cultural heritage professionals, but also because there have been a number of requests for repatriation from various cultures around the world who are asking for the remains of their ancestors to be returned to them so that they can be put to rest as per their local tradition. On one hand, a lot of remains are not fit for display due to how they were acquired, or due to the permission of the individual or the permission of the cultural group that they belong to, but there have been some interesting cases where consent to display has been provided. For example, there was once a philosopher by the name of Jeremy Bentham who asked that his body, after he died, be stuffed and preserved and put on display for all time. I won't show you a picture because it is a little bit creepy. On the other hand, you have the tragic display of the remains of Sarah Baartman. I don't want to delve too deep into her life, but some things to know about this woman is that she was from the Eastern Cape of what is today known as South Africa, and was a part of a racist freak show attraction that traveled across Europe in the 19th century. Sarah's life was filled with tragedy, and even while she was alive, she was shown off and exhibited in the show for her very non-European body type. To the European patrons who paid to go and see her at the show, she was a representative of an uncivilized world. After Sarah died, her body was kept on the grounds that she was a singular specimen of humanity and was therefore important to science. Her skeleton and a cast of her body were kept on display for over 100 years until she was finally removed and put to rest in the 1970s. So was anything learned from these scientific studies that her remains were put through? No, not a damn thing. Not a damn thing that wasn't later debunked for either being extremely sexist or extremely racist. There are dozens of examples that we can use to talk about this push to have human remains on display. We could talk about Egyptian mummies, we could talk about the Mokomokai heads from New Zealand, or we could talk about the bodies exhibition that was traveling around the world a few years ago, and how all of those remains were not willfully donated, they were just unclaimed bodies from China. I would argue that 99.9% of the time, human remains should not be put on display. The debate is ongoing over whether showing human remains, even in a museum setting, is actually providing a teaching moment. Are people actually learning something from seeing human remains, or is it just some macabre form of entertainment? If you've ever seen human remains on display in a museum, I would actually love to know what you think and what you saw. How did other guests react to seeing the remains? How did you react? Were they displayed in a respectful and contextual manner, or were they just kind of put out there to get a whoa, gross sort of reaction out of it? I'd really love to know what you think. So we have talked about human remains being on display in public spaces, but what about the scientific study of human remains? And, human remains are studied for a variety of different reasons. They're studied to discern the evolution of humankind. They're studied to discern the history of disease and diet and different populations. There's a lot to be learned from studying human remains. Museums have a lot of human remains in their collections, but so do universities and colleges, although their collections aren't brought out to the public as often. But even though these human remains are still being used for scientific purposes and, they're not being displayed to the public, a lot of these collections have super sus origins. Some private collections went on to become museums, some went on to be donated to universities, and people today are asking for the repatriation of their ancestors and their family members from both types of institutions. Repatriation has become a pretty hot topic over the last couple decades, as museums and universities and colleges are actually opening up to the idea of returning cultural objects and human remains to the cultural groups that they were taken from. There have been a number of laws and task forces that have been created in order to help facilitate repatriation in several countries around the world. For example, in Canada, a task force was created in 1994 by the Canadian Museums Association and the First Nations Assembly with the intent to help include First Nations people in the museum process and also to help facilitate the return of various cultural objects and human remains. It should be noted that this is not legally binding. We do not have anything like what the United States has, which I will come to. In England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, they have the Human Tissue Act, which was enacted in 2004. Scotland actually has its own Human Tissue Act that's separate. The 2004 Act covers anything from the donation of human organs to the display of human remains, for which you actually need a license. In the United States, in 1990, there was a law passed called the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act, which is also known as NAGPRA. And the very specific purpose of this act was to help facilitate the return of human remains and cultural objects in museum and university collections. It is by no means a perfect law, but it is still a massive step in the right direction. For the most part, museum pros and archaeologists are at least willing to come to the table to have the conversation about repatriation of human remains. But unfortunately, this ideology is not universally shared. When it comes to repatriating human remains, there are some people in this field that just don't want to. Despite the ethical teachings in anthropology and the pervasive idea that human remains should be treated with respect, some anthropologists disagree. A handful of these scientists and academics are anti-repatriation, anti-NAGPRA, and believe that ethics are getting in the way of science.
Oh, okay. I don't even have time to tell you how wrong you are. Actually, it's going to bug me if I don't.
So, as I said, over the last 2 decades, we have made some monumental steps when it comes to the repatriation of cultural objects and human remains. We have had task forces spring into action, and we have had laws enacted that help not only respect the dead, but also help send some of them home. I know we still have a long way to go, but when I look back at the last 2 decades and everything that came before it, I see good things happening. I like where this is going. But not everyone shares my sentiment, because some people think that we are moving backwards by returning human remains. There have been multiple arguments against repatriation. Dozens of articles have been written slamming this idea, and there are a number of museum professionals that are anti-repatriation. There are several people who share this ideology that I could talk about, but today I only want to talk about 2 of them, namely Elizabeth Weiss and Bruce Bourque. I'm focusing on these 2 people in particular because they have both published articles and books where they publicly endorse their anti-repatriation views, and also because they have both taught at college and university. Weiss is still teaching at San Jose State University, but Bourque is thankfully retired from teaching at Bates College. I want to talk about Bruce Bourque first. He wrote an article for an online magazine called Quillette in March 2021 titled "The Campaign to Thwart Paleogenetic Research into North America's Indigenous Peoples." Now, if you are familiar with this online magazine, Quillette, and its tendency to share articles about a certain race's superiority, you probably know where this is going. Throughout this article, Bruce Bourque pats himself on the back a bunch for all of the great work that he's done as an archaeologist, and also takes a few moments to complain about the indigenization of Canadian academia and how it all feeds into an anti-science political agenda. Bourque also discusses the archaeological history and science of the Red Paint people, a pre-Columbian people who lived on the Atlantic coast of the United States and Canada, on whom he has done extensive research over the extent of his career, and he is understandably quite invested in future research. He spends several paragraphs discussing the new work being done with DNA that could potentially provide further answers to the ongoing research on the Red Paint people. Research that I would remind you he is not an active participant in. Bourque actually reached out to the team doing this research and was actually a little bit annoyed at the minimal response he got, as he was told that they were proceeding in line with the standards and ethics of research suitable for the 21st century, standards that specifically include the continued support of present-day Indigenous communities as well as a full institutional ethics approval. This, for the record, is exactly what you're supposed to do, and good on that research team for not offering Bourque more words than he was worth. And just to be clear, it doesn't appear that this research has come to a complete standstill, nor has it been cancelled. It appears the research team is just moving forward slowly so that they can be in line with the law, NAGPRA, and just standard ethical practice. Bourque, on the other hand, it just seems to want this team to push forward regardless of ethics or the law. So essentially, Bourque is getting frustrated that ethics are getting in the way of somebody else's research. Bourque actually doubles down on his anti-NAGPRA approach further in the article. I'd even go so far as to say that in 1990, when the act was first created, everyone was fine with it. Nobody had a problem with it, which is very far from the truth. Bourque goes on to say that he doesn't like NAGPRA because it's doing exactly what it was created to do: protect and repatriate Native American graves. NAGPRA was created to essentially provoke a conversation of consent between archaeologists or museum professionals and the people who are most closely related to the human remains in question before any research or studies took place. Like I've been saying, NAGPRA isn't perfect, but the reason that Bourque opposes it is because it is getting between him and possible answers to his research questions. If you want a really easy way to learn about NAGPRA that goes into far more detail than I'll be able to get in this video, there is a really great graphic created that I'll link down in the description. That's pretty much all I have to say about Bourque, so we can move on to our next anthropologist, professor, and author, Elizabeth Weiss, who has a lot, actually, to say about repatriation, NAGPRA, and erasing the past. Weiss is an anthropology professor at San Jose State University who also specializes in skeletal analysis and osteology. She has published multiple books about bioarchaeology and human skeletal remains, as well as several articles and books where she discusses her anti-NAGPRA and anti-repatriation views, and how all of these things are anti-science. Weiss also co-authored a paper about phrenology with her late husband, and is now currently married to a man named Nick Pope, who has written several books about UFOs. Suffice to say, the pseudoscience is strong with this one. Her argument in regards to repatriation being anti-science stems from the fact that some of her samples, which are human remains, are scheduled to be returned to certain Native American groups from whence they originally came, and they are scheduled to be reburied, where she will no longer be able to work on them. Weiss argues that these groups have absolutely no right to these remains, as the bones predate the cultural group that's asking for them back. In her various writings, Weiss makes it seem like the great vault of Native American bones in these collections is going to be empty, and that Native American groups get everything that they want. But what Weiss repeatedly fails to mention is the amount of work that these groups have to go through for a set of remains to even be considered for repatriation. Not to mention the fact that they have to be legally recognized as a tribe by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So if a tribe is not legally recognized by the American government, they then have to go through the process to get that acknowledgement. However, some of these decisions made by the Indian Claims Commission, which is the commission that decides whether you're a real tribe or not, have taken up to 32 years. So with all of this being said, it's not really as easy as she seems to think it is. In her book and in some of her interviews, she also repeatedly brushes off oral tradition, saying, oh, well, they've got folklore about it, and that's all they need to prove their case for repatriation. She repeatedly talks about how unreliable they are, and in a way kind of compares it to a game of telephone, where, each person down the line changes the history a little bit. And honestly, I don't entirely disagree with her here. But I would argue that all history is one convoluted game of telephone, regardless of how it is transmitted through time. Whether it's oral tradition, parchment, or a text message, the stories change. Also, if you listen to an audiobook, does that mean that you didn't read the book? That you didn't absorb the information? I have experienced firsthand how helpful oral histories can be, and I do not think that they are given the respect that they deserve in modern academia. The problem with Weiss and oral tradition, though, is she makes it seem like that's the only thing that these groups are relying on to get these items and these remains returned, when that simply isn't the case. According to the University of Michigan's NAGPRA Policies and Procedures Manual, Section E, Evaluating Claims and Requests for Repatriation of Disposition, Part 1A, Types of Evidence, this is the type of evidence that can be used to submit a proposal for repatriation. Geographical, kinship, biological, archaeological, anthropological, linguistic, folklore, oral tradition, historical, or other relevant information or expert opinion. Notice how it doesn't just say oral tradition? So back in 2020, Weiss published this book. This awful book called Repatriation and Erasing the Past. She co-wrote it with a lawyer named James Springer, and it is a culmination of these ideas of anti-repatriation and just general racism. The author's main argument is very similar to the argument that Bourque was making in his Quillette article, namely that the repatriation of human remains is preventing academic study and preventing any future study to be done on these bones. The very title of this book is a suggestion by the authors that the act of repatriation is an act of erasing the past, which just isn't true. In my experience, when people talk about erasing the past, it's usually a knee-jerk reaction to the act of decolonizing a museum or the return of items that were stolen. The people who use this argument have a fundamental lack of understanding in not only how history works, but also how people work. First of all, a lot of the history that has supposedly been erased is actually still on clear display. What's changed is that there might be a perspective that was added to the narrative that wasn't there before. For example, I was accused of erasing the past in my discussion about the peacock dress and how it was interpreted at Kettleston Hall. In my analysis, I didn't say remove all information about colonial Britain. I suggest they do more to address that colonial history, to address their power in India, and address the impact withholding information about the history of this dress has on Indian people who might go see this dress today or in the future. History is just our interpretation of the past, and that interpretation can and should change over time. So going back to Weiss's book, she frequently discusses how the bioarchaeological study, or science, will tell the true story of the Native American people. Not the people who are still alive and well today, but science. This book discusses how, when it comes to the anthropological study of the Native American people and their bodies, academic freedom is being restricted. Repatriation laws are taking away samples that, as technology improves, they will not be able to test with this new technology because they will be in the ground. The end of the book very much speaks to the famous Ben Shapiro quote, "Facts don't care about your feelings," as the chapter concludes by discussing how there is no true way to conduct an anthropological study without the discomfort of its subjects, which is utter baloney. Now, Weiss has been defending her book, saying that it is definitely not racist or colonial in nature, but despite this, there's been a lot of criticism piling up for her. She has defended her book on Twitter as well as on various interviews, including one podcast called Honesty Offense, which was absolutely infuriating to get through, but I did it for the sake of this video. One part of this particular podcast interview is very interesting, and I want to highlight it for you though. Weiss frequently discusses the collection that she works with and why it shouldn't be repatriated, even if cultural groups want the collection and the human remains in it back for cultural reasons. And I find this really interesting because I noticed in a couple of her interviews, including the Honest Offense podcast interview, that Weiss feels that she is being discriminated against because certain cultural groups have items that should not be touched by a woman as per their traditions.
And most offensively to me is that they are discriminating against people. Many tribes have rules about not letting women handle certain remains, like warrior remains are only to be handled by men. I mean, this is sex discrimination by any other means, right?
Rules and ethics only seem to matter to Weiss when it is her culture, her ideas that are being questioned or restricted. She makes it seem like it's the Wild West out there, that people are just taking remains back left and right, when there are rules in place specifically to help facilitate the things that she is complaining about. Weiss has been very outspoken about cancel culture and how people have attempted to cancel her and get her fired from her job, etc., etc. But the thing is that people are just holding her accountable for the things that she said and obvious malpractice. We are seeing this very loud minority of people in professional and academic fields who are choosing to rebel against the laws and guidelines that are in place and are turning around shocked when there are consequences for just doing whatever you want. To hell with ethics or being a decent person. The reaction to this book from her own department at San Jose University was huge, and there are anthropologists from around the world that are calling to have this book removed from publishing. There have been several letters written to the University of Florida Press, which published this book, to have this book removed, many of which are from other anthropologists. For example, we have a letter from the British Association for Biological Anthropology, and there's the main letter that was signed by multiple anthropologists and anthropology professors from universities around the world, condemning the racist and colonial attitudes contained in this book. I think it goes without saying, but I'm gonna say it anyway. I think that this book and this anti-repatriation movement is actively harmful to Indigenous communities and populations around the world. It has the ideologies that this field of anthropology has been trying to move away from for decades, and this book and all of these anti-repatriation and anti-NAGPRA ideologies fly directly into the face of all of the progress that we've made. Trust is slowly being rebuilt between museums and these cultural heritage institutions and the public and Indigenous communities, and if we aren't careful, we could sacrifice all that.
What you're doing here is unethical. It's immoral. I'll fight it.
With all of this movement to decolonize our institutions, museums are faced with the monumental task of reconciliation and repatriation. And it's a big task, but I think it's one that's worth doing and putting everything that we have into. If you are interested in reading any of the articles mentioned in this video, including some of the laws, I have linked everything down below. I hope that by the end of this video you've maybe learned something about repatriation. I'm really looking forward to seeing some interesting and respectful discussions in the comment section. If you're new here, please don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you next time.